Learn to think using riddles, brain teasers, and wordplay. Develop a quick wit, think more creatively and cleverly, and train your problem-solving instincts. Written by Patrick King, narrated by Russell Newton. Everyone loves a good riddle. A riddle is a little hard to define, but we all know one when we see it. It's typically a phrase or question that has some veiled or double meaning, and which forces us to think really carefully about the answer. Riddles may seem like nothing more than child's play. The last time you answered one may have been in childhood, but riddles have a long and illustrious past. Riddles are a universal art found in all cultures and have been studied by linguists, anthropologists, theologists, and more to understand how and why human beings use these peculiar tales, questions, or puzzles. Want some proof? Here is a riddle mentioned in Greek antiquity. In other words, over 2,000 years ago. Ares sent the Sphinx from her Ethiopian homeland. The Greeks always remembered the foreign origin of the Sphinx to Thebes in Greece, where she asked all passers-by the most famous riddle in history. Which creature has one voice and yet becomes four-footed and two-footed and three-footed? She strangled and devoured anyone who could not answer. Oedipus solved the riddle by answering, man, who crawls on all fours as a baby, then walks on 2 feet as an adult, and then uses a walking stick in old age. By some accounts, but much more rarely, there was a second riddle. There are 2 sisters. One gives birth to the other, and she, in turn, gives birth to the first. Who are the 2 sisters? The answer is day and night. Both words, Humera and Nyx, respectively, are feminine in ancient Greek. Riddles seem to play with the flexible boundaries of language, showing us the intellectual conventions we didn't even know we were using. Riddles lay bare our ordinary assumptions about the way the world works, and show us that things are not quite as they seem. They provide moments of surprise, shock, and even dumbfoundedness. They make us feel that we're not as bright as we would like to be, and that we are blind to the obvious. On hearing the answer, we get a flash of insight and understanding, a little joke for the mind that's like the equivalent of an optical illusion, or an object that seems to change color completely when tilted in the light. Over time, riddles became a way of relating to others, and even the basis for philosophical questions, thought experiments, and methods of understanding the world around us. Riddles are more than simple wordplay, as this book will demonstrate, and can be used as tools for a range of purposes. In this book, we'll be exploring riddles for a few reasons, not least of which because they're fun. Riddles can also be thought of as mini exercises for the conceptual mind, and a way to develop critical thinking and analytical skills, as well as strengthen the ability to think creatively. Out-of-the-box thinking may feel random and spontaneous in the moment, but in the chapters that follow, we'll see how there are actually predictable formulas and techniques that can help us solve problems at a higher level than we're used to. Riddles are a brilliant way to practice and learn about these different ways of thinking, if we know how to use them. You can read all you want about different types of thinking. It's an important piece of the puzzle. But if you never apply them in a significant way, then all that knowledge will be for naught. So first, let's consider the mental tools we have at our disposal when approaching the task that is a riddle. In reality, this is about evaluating the problems and novel situations in our lives and gaining better understanding and methods to navigate them effectively, quickly, and strategically. Thinking modalities. People seldom think of thinking as something they need to practice, develop, or strengthen. It's almost as though we assume this skill is a given and something that will run more or less on its own. Most of us are more focused on developing skills and what could be called crystallized intelligence, essentially knowledge and information. But can we develop muscles in the body without exercise? Can we use any tool at all without first understanding how best to use that tool? What can we actually do with the tool by itself and no type of instruction manual for best practices? This is how the vast majority navigate the world, but we can do better than that. Thinking is an aptitude that is more fluid than we think and more prone to bias, misconception, lazy assumption, shortcuts, weak hypotheses, and plain old habit. Realizing that your brain can and should be used to its full potential is like suddenly discovering that all along you've been using a precious and sophisticated piece of technology as a doorstop. Our brains can do so much more, but we have to deliberately give ourselves the opportunity to consider how we're thinking in the first place, and then dedicate the time to improving it. Let's take a look at some of the tools that will be in our arsenal at the end of this book. Going outside the box. What do you know about creativity? Do you imagine that it's something a bit like a flash of light from nowhere, something that only the rare, gifted person has access to? Perhaps you think it's a left brain versus right brain phenomena, and that some people are just born better able to create and think up new ideas. We'll abandon these conventional ideas for one reason: they're limiting and limited. Instead, we'll look at creativity with curiosity and try to understand what it is. What is a creative person actually doing when they bring something completely new into the world? In understanding the function and nature of creativity, we can then learn to practice it ourselves. More on this later when we explore riddles. In time, we will be able to systematically become more creative. It sounds like an oxymoron, but most things in this world can be trained and cultivated, and very few things are dependent on raw talent and luck. Divergent thinking is the name given to the kind of intellectual activity that explores and expands on as many solutions or alternatives as possible. Quick, think of a simple iron nail. How many uses can you think of for a single iron nail? The activity that your brain engages in to do this is called divergent thinking. Being flexible and open, the idea is to brainstorm and open the field right up. This kind of thinking, crucially, needs to be removed from goal-oriented convergent thinking. It works best when you suspend judgment, i.e., telling yourself, "That's a stupid idea," and simply let ideas flow as they will. This is the kind of opening up rather than narrowing down kind of thinking. The type of thinking to solve riddles is, you guessed it, almost purely divergent. When three of the most obvious descriptions of assumptions fail, where do you go from there? You must start to think outside your conventional boundaries and diverge. Without it, you'll be running your head into the same wall repeatedly. Lateral thinking is also a term you may be familiar with. In contrast to vertical thinking, which is step-by-step and rather predictable, lateral thinking seems to take a step to the side, into a new dimension. It makes you ask how you get from point A to point B, and attempts to detach from the current scenario. Lateral thinking is the act of mentally manipulating factors and situations. We'll see plenty of examples of lateral thinking in the riddles that follow later in this book, and it's this kind of thinking that is best for problem solving or generating truly novel ideas. Imagine a classic maze printed on a piece of paper with an in and an out. You're given a pencil and told to solve it. You might go about drawing a line from in to out, winding along the paths of the maze. Or, if you were thinking laterally, you might simply draw a long line outside the maze, bypassing the entire thing. You've still solved the puzzle, only not on its own terms. In doing so, you found the solution at a different level of thinking than the problem was created. Going even further, you could solve the problem in an even more outlandish way. By curling the paper in on itself, you can bring the in to the out in three-dimensional space, allowing your pencil to make the tiny jump from one to the other. You've solved the problem again, by now completely breaking the rules of both previous solutions. You might then pull a matrix-style trick and claim, as your final solution, that there is no paper. The point of this thought exercise is to expand your mind and imagine what if rules didn't exist. Systems thinking is similar in that it is the ability to see and comprehend the bigger picture, as well as how all its components fit inside it. Understanding large-scale interrelations is sometimes enough to solve a problem creatively. Connecting the dots, synthesizing separate ideas, seeing the whole, and perceiving relationships and connections are invaluable for those platforms in life that are greater than the sum of their parts, i.e., most of them. As an example, you may be dealing with a difficult person and unsure how to get them to see your point of view. But really, you can fix things by seeing their point of view. When you understand who their boss is, what their objectives and motivations are, and all the complex links that connect you to them, you can better understand their position to your benefit. By zooming out, you add context and dimension to the situation and act accordingly. Many of us have the problem of getting caught in the weeds. For another analogy, not being able to see the forest through the trees. Systems thinking implores you to see the clues and hints that inevitably exist in every situation and expand on what they could mean for you. It may not appear to be a type of creative thinking at first glance, but if it's something that forces a different perspective, it counts. Finally, inspirational thinking is also a kind of creative thinking, and it can be best described as receiving insight or inspiration from somewhere else entirely. Take an entirely different activity, mindset, discipline, or field, and force apply this to your current situation. For instance, generating ideas that must start with each letter of the alphabet. This gives you 26 ideas, as well as fitting an intentional constraint. This results in a sudden explosion of understanding, or a peak experience, a light bulb switching on in your head. It can seem like this flash of creative insight is unpredictable, a freebie from the mythical muses, but people who have these insights often lay extensive groundwork and actively court those insights one way or another. Salvador Dali, for example, was known to drift off to sleep with a spoon deliberately held loosely in his hand, balanced above a china plate. As he began to dream, his grip would loosen and he'd drop the spoon. The clattering on the plate would wake him up instantly. He'd then reach for his notepad nearby and scribble down all the images that had come to his half-awake mind. He called this chasing hypnagogic sleep, as he wanted to play in the area of consciousness between waking and sleep. In a similar way, August Kekuli is reported to have had a dream about a snake biting its own tail, and in a flash, understood the ring-like structure of the benzene molecule, a puzzle that had filled his waking hours. Others received this inspiration from altered states of consciousness, like dreams, mystical experiences, or even profound moments during meditation or time spent in nature. We can access this state by simply stepping away from the problem at times and letting our unconscious mind do the work for us. The more varied and different your experiences are, the more mental models you can try on for size and apply to different situations. Mastering critical thinking. Creative and divergent thinking can be thought of as simultaneously subtypes and examples of one another, wherein the mind goes from a small, narrow, or limited perspective and opens up. This requires different types of frameworks to not be stuck in a box of our own creation. Convergent thinking, on the other hand, goes the other direction and takes many strains of thoughts and ideas and boils them down to a narrower conclusion or solution. It's finding a way inside the given rules rather than breaking them or seeking new rules and outside solutions. Insight comes from digging deeper rather than looking elsewhere. This is a process of further understanding a narrower set of information and then attempting to draw conclusions from it via analysis and insight. These are both ways of problem solving, which is the true skill that riddles help us cultivate. Whether you go broader or more specific, it's clear that our mental status quo can't quite cut it. The first thing to remember is that critical step-by-step thinking is not really all that separate from nonlinear, insightful, or creative thinking. In fact, the two often go hand in hand, solving one another's unfinished business. In developing all aspects of cognition, we equip ourselves with more tools to use on any problem or situation we're faced with. We can expand in one moment, gathering data, exploring arguments, and taking in the general logic of a problem, before narrowing down again, drawing conclusions, and fashioning a single solution. Either way, we're challenging ourselves and using different perspectives. No style of thinking is better than the other. Rather, it's knowing which is most appropriate to use in each situation. Questions like, what is the atomic weight of magnesium, require a different kind of thinking than do more open-ended questions like, how are we going to get our sales team to cooperate more in the office? For some problems, you need as many answers as possible, or there is no right answer, but for others, you really want to hone in on the single best solution. Riddles force you to alternate between them. Critical thinking is broadly convergent instead of divergent. It seeks to whittle down, to find coherence, and to unpick the components of a problem in the same way you'd take apart an appliance. Though creativity is a kind of intelligence, and intelligent people are invariably deeply creative thinkers, it is critical thinking that's most often regarded as thinking in general. People who wish to bolster their intelligence often train their analytical skills. We can ask the same question here as we did above. What are people actually doing when they think intelligently and logically about a problem? The first step is usually identification, actually seeing and acknowledging what the problem is, diagnosing the issue, and finding all the aspects influencing it. You can never provide adequate solutions if you don't understand the problem sufficiently. During this stage, you might ask questions like, what am I really looking at here? What's the question or problem? Who are the actors and what are they doing and why? Can I identify cause and effect relationships here? What am I trying to achieve and what information am I missing? And so on. The next step entails a little research. Once you've broadly identified the field in which your problem is taking place, you can begin to explore various options, arguments, or possible solutions. Look at information and consider its quality. Verify your sources and independently look at arguments to see how persuasive they are and how they're making that argument. Evaluate different possibilities with an eye to a solution. These research skills are invaluable in making sure that you're not using faulty assumptions or bad data to come to your conclusions. A great critical thinking skill is to routinely ask, what do I think and why do I think this? What's the evidence? You could also deliberately search for the opposing argument to counter your own unconscious bias. Rather than merely look for data that supports your already held conclusions, it can help to ask yourself what you're not seeing. This is a step that most people don't make it to, so if you're getting to this stage, you're already significantly ahead of the pack. This leads naturally to the next step, although all these functions typically overlap: identifying bias. This requires something that we don't often acknowledge when we think of intelligence: the ability to be discerning. Information needs to be appraised as neutrally and objectively as possible. To do this requires humility, honesty, and a lot of maturity, plus a little creative thinking to look into your own blind spots. Debate with yourself. Find the flaws, weak points, and assumptions in how you're thinking. Actively take an opposing view to understand your own flaws and potential weak points. Challenge yourself to find evidence for your beliefs and assumptions, and be ready to abandon those that are genuinely incorrect. This is the only way learning can ever happen. The worst thing you can do is assume that you are correct and that there are elements of your thinking that are infallible and not worthy of testing. This aspect of critical thinking is perhaps more important than any raw intellectual power, because even the best arguments and most useful information will be ignored if too much ego is involved, or if someone has simply failed to consider all the facts at hand. Our world is overflowing with information, but not all of it is high quality. Yes, that even includes some of yours. If you find yourself resisting a question or assertion, take a second to pause and ask yourself if you're truly dedicated to finding the truth of the matter or simply defending something else, like your ego. We need to consistently ask who is presenting the information and why. What is their agenda, and how do they benefit from these claims? Is it logical, relevant, incomplete, up to date? This may not seem immediately applicable when it comes to riddles, but many riddles do in fact trick us when we fail to properly appraise the problem or fully consider the nature and quality of the information presented to us. Inference, or the closely related deduction, is the act of arriving at a conclusion given the information or premises in front of you. This is a process of extrapolation, guessing at some unknown piece of information based on known pieces of information. For example, if you discovered that someone hadn't worked for 20 years, you may infer that their unemployment was unfortunate and may be due to some sort of disability. In this example, you can see that inferences can be incorrect. The person may well be independently wealthy, or someone like a monk or nun who doesn't work at all. An inference is an educated guess, but it's still just a guess and is only as good as the premises it's based on. More specifically, a deduction, in the classic philosophical sense at least, is used when there is no possibility of the conclusion being wrong given the premises. For example, I can have the following. All students scoring below 50% fail the test, as well as this student has obtained 42%. Using deduction, I can make the conclusion this student has failed the test. I have moved from a general principle to a special case. Deduction of this kind is rarer in real life than general inference, but sometimes mistakes can be avoided by simply knowing which one you're actually dealing with. Induction, the opposite, is more informal logic and moves from a specific case to a general principle. For example, the sun rose yesterday, and it rose today as well. It will probably rise tomorrow too. To improve inferential thinking, you need to only improve the quality of the information you're basing your conclusions on. Many of the riddles we'll look at are deliberate tricks in that they withhold a crucial piece of information that's needed to come to the right conclusion. Clues are always useful in critical thinking, but always remember that they're just that, clues. Another aspect of critical thinking is determining relevance. All of the above steps assume that you're only considering information that is actually pertinent to the situation at hand. This in itself requires some skill. How do you know when to stop looking, or whether a piece of data is worth including in your analysis? You don't want to get sidetracked with totally irrelevant data, but you also don't want to miss out on crucial information. The best approach is to have a goal in mind and constantly measure new information against this goal. With many goals, you might need to rank them in order of importance. When you find yourself encountering repeated data, it's a sign you've thoroughly explored the space, but you may have to be satisfied with enough information to merely allow you to identify trends. Like biases, information should constantly be checked for its value in the bigger picture. Can you omit a dozen weak ideas in favor of a single better or more representative one? Finally, curiosity is a vital but sometimes overlooked part of critical thinking. The truth is, information seldom comes to find us and present itself perfectly formed. Rather, it is us who has to go and seek it out deliberately, sometimes asking why many times over to get to the crux of an issue. It's easy to lose the curiosity habit and take things at face value, but sometimes the best critical thinking is done when people are not satisfied with the standard answer. Critical thinking is solutions-oriented and convergent, but that doesn't mean you can't regularly ask yourself, is this all there is? And go poking around until something catches your interest. Keep things open-ended. At the end of every solution, you often find 3 more interesting problems. Putting it all together. Having outlined a general vocabulary for the different kinds of thinking, however, isn't quite the same as knowing how and when to use these different cognitive modes or techniques. When you're out there in the real world, solving real problems as they emerge, you will use a blend of all of the above. To become a better thinker, then, takes not only familiarity with the nuts and bolts of thinking, but practical awareness of how to use those skills synergistically in the moment. This is something that author Warren Berger thought about a lot, and is behind the method he outlines in his book, A More Beautiful Question. His idea is that the quality and breadth of our knowledge about the world comes down, in large part, to the quality and depth of the questions we pose to it. By learning to ask better questions, in a more formal and deliberate process, we give ourselves deeper access to knowledge and insight. Good questions are the fundamental basis of the scientific method in general. By doing science, we ask, in many complex and varied ways, if I do this, what happens? Berg's model suggests 3 steps or stages and is useful because it combines many of the skills we've explored in the previous section. To ask truly innovative questions, we should structure them as why, what if, and how. Each requires a different mindset, but all 3 work together for maximum effectiveness. The 3 questions give us time to switch tools, try on different thinking modes, and give ourselves a better chance at arriving at a comprehensive and intelligent solution. Let's begin where all interesting things begin, with why. This plunges us into the world of understanding. Why is the situation as it is? Why this way and not some other way? You can even ask why the question or problem has been formulated in the way it has, or why we're asking the question in the first place. Every problem-solving attempt must start from the beginning. You need to understand why things are as they are if you have a hope of changing them into something else. Asking why also gives you permission to see if things are in fact wrong or could be improved on. You open the door for something else. Hello again, critical thinking. We don't need to be rebels or contrarians to constantly ask why of the world. Merely adopting a curious stance in the face of the ordinary and expected shows our willingness to engage and understand at a deeper level. By asking why, we peek under the hood and examine our assumptions, beliefs, shortcuts, unspoken desires, and blind spots. For example, the sales team is experiencing friction, and bad office politics is beginning to undermine productivity. You could ask, why exactly is everyone unhappy? Why is this now suddenly a problem but wasn't a month ago? Why have previous attempts to fix the problem failed? Why do we have the sales team all in one office anyway? By using why, we shine a light on all the cause and effect relationships in every nook and cranny of the problem. We use identification, curiosity, inference, research, and curiosity to feel the problem out. This will come especially handy when trying to solve riddles that are carefully worded and presented. But in truth, the same process occurs in everyday life. Next, we open up further and ask, what if? Now we open to solutions, i.e., different ways of doing things. Here, we go down a new path of inquiry or create a different aspect to explore. Can we combine old ideas in new ways? Can we switch perspective? Here, we flex our more creative thinking skills. Lateral, divergent, or systems thinking allows us to reach out and try something different. What if we did nothing and let the sales team sort it out on their own? What if the sales team worked from home from now on? What if all this friction is a good thing? What if the friction is alerting us to a bigger problem in the business? As with all creative thinking, this step needs to be done without self-censorship or the fear of not finding a solution quickly enough. On the other hand, dwelling too long on the what if can result in stagnant analysis paralysis. That's where determining relevance will come in handy. You could follow each of the above questions with a more practical, concrete how. This will allow you to quickly disqualify ideas that won't practically work and focus in on those with more real-world potential. What if we do nothing? How? Well, that's easy. We don't do anything and check in a month to see the result. What if they work from home? How? That will be difficult. some of the work needs to be done in person. What if the friction is a good thing? How? On second thought, it does appear to have few advantages for anyone. What if the friction is alerting us to a bigger business problem? How? We could start by asking the sales team what the problem is. How? We could conduct individual interviews and see if we can find a common answer, then decide if there's a bigger issue, and so on. You'll notice that this kind of thinking is more or less an expanded version of the scientific methods, if I do this, what will happen? By combining both creative and analytical thinking skills, the problem is expanded and analyzed, allowing a methodical process that leads to a well-considered solution. We first stock our toolkit with as many useful tools as possible, and then devise a structured method for taking out each one in turn when it's most needed and appropriate. This approach even allows us to devise new tools as necessary. Another way to synthesize all these different aspects of thinking is called reverse engineering. The trouble with using different cognitive tools is that one size most certainly does not fit all. Sometimes you need a tool that is so specific it can literally only solve the very unique problem you have in front of you. In this case, reverse engineering can help you design that tool working from the solution backward, rather than trying to trial and error the tools you already have and hoping one fits. The term is obviously borrowed from the engineering world and refers to starting with a finished gadget or appliance, then deconstructing it to find out how it works, pulling apart its components to better understand how they function. This, in contrast to building the appliance from the ground up. Anytime we look at a finished problem or situation, we can reverse engineer it and ask, what happened to bring about this state of affairs? What circumstances and actors came together, and in what way to produce this finished product, i.e., the problem or solution in front of you? We can also use this way of thinking to design a way of thinking itself, i.e., a mental tool. We can ask ourselves, what would it look like if I knew the answer here? What form would my solution take? What would be different if I didn't have this problem? In this way, you're starting from a finished tool, i.e., the solution, and working your way backward. This can be tricky to do and takes time, but is enormously powerful when done properly. It's a line of questioning that allows for the generation of new ideas and for creative thinking, but all within a clearly delineated field of relevance, because you've already identified the end point or goal. Try out your proposed solutions or tools and see what happens. If they worked, what worked and why? If not, what does it tell you about your tool, about the assumptions you used to make your tool? The process is iterative and dynamic. You can keep going as long as you're curious and want to improve on your process. In the sales team example, we can consider the situation as it is as a complex social machine. How could we take it apart and look at how it works? If we wanted to design a machine that would result in maximum conflict and inefficiency, how would we do it? And what does it tell us about the right way to do things? Whichever way we choose to use the many different cognitive tools at our disposal, there's no escaping the fact that problem solving, creativity, and analytical thought are best experienced and practiced and not merely talked about. In that spirit, we'll turn our attention now to the more practical part of our book, the riddles themselves. As you read through each one, try to resist the urge to leap ahead and read the answer without trying first. The real value of a riddle is in its unsolved form. See the answer too soon, and you rob yourself of the chance to puzzle through it yourself. Read through the riddle, pause, and consider which of the thinking modes already discussed could come in handy. Slow down and become deliberate and obvious in your thinking. Ask yourself, what assumptions am I making? What kind of problem or question is this? What conventions am I relying on? Does this puzzle look like anything I've done before? And so on. Lastly, don't get too frustrated if you simply can't figure a puzzle out. Some people relish a real challenge, but others will find themselves frustrated, at a dead end without any further insight. Remember, the goal of a riddle is not to find the answer, but to explore and strengthen the processes that allow you to find the answer. These are only silly cognitive games. The real gain is to be had in the more finely developed sense of creative, analytical, and abstract thought you'll earn as a result of going through them. So don't worry if a good few of these riddles completely stump you. Takeaways. Riddles are phrases or questions framed in the form of puzzles that require all types of thinking to deduce its answer or some double meaning underlying its words. They employ several different patterns of thinking, challenging us to work with limited information in unique ways. No one style of thinking is better than the other. Each is useful in different situations, and we must grasp how to apply them correctly. This is exactly what riddles help us learn, since it involves many different thinking styles. The most important tool that helps solve riddles is divergent thinking. This form of thinking demands that you survey and analyze all possible solutions to any given problem. In its opposite, convergent or critical thinking, we generally operate within a set of rules and use them to work our way to arrive at answers. However, in divergent thinking, the rules are immaterial, and we must explore any and all relevant solutions. Other important tools include lateral thinking, which involves studying how we infer something from information given to us. Systems thinking calls on you to look at the bigger picture, namely, how components of any idea or solution fit with one another to form a coherent whole. Lastly, inspirational thinking requires you to gain insight from some source, like a peak experience or an altered state of consciousness. This type of thinking lets our unconscious mind solve problems for us, allowing our conscious selves to benefit from it. A complete problem-solving strategy involves a certain sequence that combines all of these thinking frameworks. Often, the first step is to identify the specifics of the problem you're faced with. Following that, you need to evaluate the quality of the information available through research. Identify any biases you may have, and debate with yourself to recognize any holes in your logic. This has been Learn to Think Using Riddles, Brain Teasers, and Wordplay. Develop a quick wit, think more creatively and cleverly, and train your problem-solving instincts. Written by Patrick King, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2020 by Patrick King. Production copyright by Patrick King.